So thank you to everybody to join again this training on safety and risk management. Last time we, let's say, general described the information for the risk assessment and specifically for the chemical risk. Today, we are going just briefly to short recap the health and safety regulations and the risk assessment and provide, let's say, a summary of the chemical evaluation for the specific risk. But then we go on with biological and noise risk and the manual handling of loads and electromagnetic radiation as a specific risk in the company. These are selected coming from your request during the previous training course. Then, since especially for the partners that are involved in BIOnTop project, we have further course in the next week. So we can select more risk if you wanted to, let's say, understand and go in deeper with the specific risk. Then we can, let's say, describe better the procedures, what has to be done from the employer, but also from the workers. That is very, very important for the risk management within the company, but also within the research project, which is, let's say, an innovative activity. So we don't know what are specific risks in several equipment, several, let's say, procedures, steps of the process, a new process, and etc. And finally, and this is very, very important also for BIOnTop project, we are going to discuss and to understand better what are the safety requirements for, especially for end users in terms of the verification of the compliance for the food contact regulation. This is very important in case of the production of packaging for food field. So let's go briefly on the framework directive for the health and safety aspects. We have one only regulation that is, let's say, in force now, and many different directives on specific risks, with the description of each risk that is inside a process, a company, an industry, and so on. As I said the previous time, all this list is not going to be described, obviously, but we are going to see, let's say, some specific aspects of noise, for example, of biological agents, of manual handling of loads, so that we can understand better what are the right procedures, what are the, let's say, the attention that we have to put on for the workers. This is the, let's say, most important information that we have to keep in mind when we are going to analyze the risk inside a company during the process and so on. First of all, we have to, let's say, develop a series of measures in terms of preventive and protective approach that has to start with the elimination of the risk when it is possible. The second step is for the substitution, then the control through the use of engineering controls or organizational measures. We have to, after this, decreasing the risk by the design of safe work systems, also thanks to administrative control measures. And lastly, we have to provide appropriate personal protective equipment for the workers. But this is the last step that we can put in the field, okay? So this is very, very important to understand this importance of the approaches. Then we understood, I hope, that the risk is evaluated considering the probability that an event can happen and the severity of the damage. These metrics that we can obtain considering both probability and severity is the final calculation that we can do to assess, let's say, all the main risks. Several risks has different rules, different formula, but in general, this approach can be applied for all the main risks. Sorry. Then we described the differences between safety and health. And the most important aspect is that the safety depends on the occurring of accidents. On the contrary, the health depends on the exposure to physical, chemical, and biological agents with a longer terms of assessment. We cannot see the effect on the health as soon as possible or immediately, let's say, but just with a longer term effect. These two aspects are interconnected, surely, but need to be addressed with different tools. So, in general, the general setting of the risk assessment is based on this sequence: the identification of the risks, the measure of the risks, and evaluation. And, at the end, we can provide, let's say, a judgment, a score, a comparison with specific limit for each risk to assess if the risk is low, medium, high, and so on. We, let's say, just presented the several risks for the safety in workplaces. Many of them are evaluated with the matrix probability multiplied severity, and also the risks for the health. And as you wrote in the chat in the previous time, the winner are the chemical agents. We can, I can provide you just a summary of the main consideration for the dangerous chemicals that can be applied also for nanomaterials. But as I said, this is a very, very difficult, let's say, field. Also, in this case, the regulation for nanomaterials is ongoing and is improving in this period. And I'd like not to provide you very general information. I provide you the school that will be held in June, if I'm not wrong, on nanomaterials. And if you are interested, this is very, very good school, very good training to attend. Then today we are going to evaluate the noise risk, which is, let's say, included in the physical agents, and it's important for several equipment that you can have in your facility, in your company. We are going to have some general information on electromagnetic radiation, since I'm not expert on this field, but the general regulation can provide just, let's say, an overview on this risk assessment. We will see about biological agents, the risk, the microbiological risks, and the risk for the manual handling of loads. Some also in this case general procedures, regulation, right behavior from workers, and so on. The overview and the summary of the chemical risks. The directive is 98 and 24 from the European Commission that defines all the regulation or the steps that has to be put in place for the assessment of the chemical risks due to chemical substances, dangerous chemical substances. Starting from the general classification, labeling, and packaging of the materials for the understanding of the dangerous characteristics of the chemicals. And all this information are provided within the safety data sheets of the specific material. This is important for us to understand which is the dangerous characteristics, one or more, and what we can do to handle this material, to use this material, to storage this material, and so on. And how can we perform the chemical risk assessment? Firstly, we need to identify all the substances and preparations that are used within the lab, the company, the process, and so on. And we have the list of these materials. Then we have to review the processes to verify if other dangerous chemical agents can be developed during this process. And the list has to be updated with this information. And then we have to classify, or better, to collect the classification of all these chemical agents from the hazardous statements that can be found within the the safety data sheet, sorry. For this collection of information from this, we can, let's say, understand if there is a specific risk, chemical risk within our company. If the substances are not dangerous, the amount are very low, and so on, we can classify that the risk is low or irrelevant for the chemical experts. On the contrary, and usually it is in this way, we need to go on the second phase and to perform a specific risk assessment for workers. We have to consider several variables for this evaluation, especially the dangerous properties, the information from the safety data sheets, level, type, and duration of the exposure, and so on. We have to collect also the environmental situation within the company, if there are some specific measures in terms of preventive or protective aspects, and so on. And at the end, we need to give a score, an index to the severity aspects. So in terms of the characteristics of these chemical agents, we have to give the index for the probability of the specific risk, and this is strictly linked to the amount of material that is within the company. And at the end, for the safety aspects, we can perform the evaluation of the risks, giving a final score of this risk. Then with the classification, we can obtain the final judgment for the risks that can be low, moderate, medium, or high. And this is, let's say, with the same approach, the evaluation for the health aspects. So the severity index, giving from 6, for example, to carcinogen or mutagens chemical agents, till 1, where no threshold limit value, so the limit for specific substances is applied. And then we have also the probability index, taking into consideration the limit that is provided by the regulation for this specific chemical substance. And at the end, we can perform the formula, the application of the formula, and provide the evaluation of the chemical risks. So I don't know if all is clear for the chemical aspects. Last time, someone of you asked about a specific chemical evaluation. This was explained during the second part of the training last time. So if there is something not clear, please write in the chat so that in the question and answer session, I can, let's say, detail better if there is something unclear. So let's go on with the biological risks. This is another important risk in the workplaces, since many biological agents can be present within specific work. What is a biological agent? Is any microorganism, even if genetically modified, but I don't know if this could be your case, that could provoke infections, allergies, intoxications, and so on. There are many of them, you can see in the slide, the bacteria, molds, also virus. And all these microorganisms can have a risk for the health of the workers. So as to be monitored and assessed depending from the specific condition in your workplace. There is the specific regulation that deal with the biological risk, as you can see in red in the bottom of the slide, where you can find many information for the management, for the controlling of these specific risk. In general, just to provide you some general information, there are neutral microorganisms which are, let's say, are not dangerous for the human. The people can come in contact with them, but there is no effect on the health specifically. There are also useful microorganisms, for example, for the production of wine, bread, beer, and so on. And also these ones are not dangerous for us. But there are the harmful microorganisms that can be deterrent or pathogens. The first one can alter foods or other substances by modifying the organoleptic properties. So that can be, let's say, dangerous, but not so critical, let's say. And then there are the pathogens. These are available to cause even severe diseases. So these are the worst one, let's say. Sorry. Okay. How can come within our body? There are several routes, as more or less for the other risks, by ingestion, by contact, by direct entry into the blood. For example, if you can, let's say, cut your skin or something similar, or for inhalation. All these ways are possible entry for the biological agents. In general, the inhalation is the most important way for workplaces. So we consider especially these aspects. And in general, sorry for the animation, how can they enter? They can enter thanks to, let's say, bioaerosol, which is a dispersion of a liquid or a solid in a gaseous medium, for example, air, usually air. And when this liquid or this solid contain living particles, so the microorganisms, or some substances that can be originated by them, we specifically talk about bioaerosol. The dimension of the particles are very, very important for the diffusion in the environment and for their dangerousness. This aerosol can be generated from very strong mixing, forced dispersion, impact of water on solid surfaces, or for example, powder that can be moved very, very fast or strongly. So, as we said, for example, these are the three main entries into the organisms. Then it is necessary that the organisms, the microorganisms, find, let's say, the positive conditions. For example, an host that is, let's say, susceptible of for the injection. Then also the number of microorganisms has to be very high, and it has to be higher than the minimum infectious dose. And then also the microorganism has to be pathogen, so has to be able to cause disease. So, especially for inhalation, the operating modes are very important to understand if there is a specific risk. So we have to know the possible exposure. We need to understand and apply if there is a possibility to reduce the production of the aerosol and bioaerosol. We have to reduce the duration of the exposure. So if a specific number of workers has to stay in the area where there is a bioaerosol, we need to decrease as much as possible this duration. Then we can apply specific personal protective equipment, in particular face mask, as we know from, for example, the COVID period, unfortunately. This is, let's say, a specific note that I'd like to provide you about what we have to do and what we don't have to do. Since we, for example, for a very high biological risk exposure, we need to change, for example, the mask very often. It depends from the specific amount of microorganisms, but it's important to not reuse the mask for too long time. And also we need to wear in the best way as possible. And I think you remember that you have to close on the nose, to put in front of the mouth, and so on. So this is just a summary of specific procedure for the wearing of the mask. Then, for example, for the contact or injury of your skin, you have to be aware in case of some cutting material can produce an injury to you. Reduce this possibility, avoid the direct contact whenever possible, and especially sorry, we need to wear personal protective equipment like protective glasses or gloves or footwear and so on. Also in this case, it's important to consider that also the gloves are, let's say, only one usage. You need to change them if they are not more efficient. And also we can have, let's have a look here on the top of the slide, the right procedure to remove them and not to reuse the same gloves that you before take off. So that you have to take off from the first hand, and then with the second one, you have to close the gloves externally, let's say, not to touch them with your hand, just to avoid any possible contact with specific microorganisms and to reduce the biological risks. Another thing that is very, very important, and then I can explain better why, the washing of your hands. This means that it's important in all the workplaces, but also at home, let's say, to wash them in the best way. And it's important to have time. We don't just need to push them under the water and then dry them. No, we need to wash as better as possible. And I think that also from the COVID pandemic, we had several information. But it's important that we have time to wash them with liquid soap, with hot water. It's important also these aspects, and all the part of the hand. As you can see in the picture, there are 11 steps, let's say, for the right washing of your hand. Why? Since if unfortunately we are online with this meeting, but if we could be in presence, we can perform this test. And if you put a specific material that is visible by ultraviolet rays, you can see that usually our hands are not so clean. The bacteria can be present on our hands, and this is important for the assessment also of the biological risks. Usually we perform this test to let people understand that this risk is present even if we cannot see it. On the contrary, for example, when we use chemical substances, we have the bottle with the specific pictogram with all the risks, and we can understand easily the risk that this is present. For the biological risk, we cannot see it, but in this way you can understand that this risk is truly present on your hand. So let's go on also with the noise risk. What is the noise? If you have any question on the biological risk, please write in the chat, and then we can discuss also later. So what is the noise? The noise is defined as an unwanted signal of natural or artificial origin. It could have a frequency, a level, and a variability that is specific, but that can provoke unknowing of the human hair, and also for, especially for workers due, for example, for specific equipment, machines, and so on. Here you can find the reference for the European directive and also several updates from different European member states, since the European regulation is, let's say, less stringent, but several European member states has provided an update and also more stringent requirements, limits, and so on for the regulation. We have to understand that the noise risks has an effect on the human body, not only for the hearing damage, so the ability of hear, but also for other aspects. For example, for non-hearing damage, we can have also alteration of internal organs and systems, for example, digestive, nervous, respiratory system, and so on. We can have also indirect consequences, for example, stress or decrease in concentration, also induced injuries, that is very, very important. And lastly, we can have also irreversible hearing damages. This can happen when the noise is very, very, very high, above 140 decibel, has, let's say, peak measure. But if the exposure to this value of noise is for a long time, the effect can be very, very serious. How we evaluate the noise risk? On this case, we don't use the formula for the risk, that is probability multiplied severity. In this case, we evaluate the time-weighted average value of noise exposure level for 8-hour working day. And this is evaluated with the measurement made by a phonometer, which is an instrument. I put the, sorry, 1 second. This is in the top of the slide. This is something similar to this equipment that can register the noise in a room next to an equipment or in the sector where you can work or you have some specific noise emission. So we evaluate this LEX value for 8 hours or for a weekly exposure of the worker by making the average evaluation of each working day during the week. We have several levels of exposure. So if the measurement recorded a value lower than 80 decibel, as in the yellow part of the table, no specific obligations has to be performed within the company. But when we arrive at 80 decibel, as a measured level, we are facing the lower action value. So after this value, the results has to be, let's say, also verified within the week, but in any case, the employer has to provide training and information for workers, has to provide personal protective personal equipment that has to be available for the workers, but it is not mandatory to use them, only for workers lower than 18 years old. And also the surveillance for health made by the doctor, the specific doctor, that has to be provided to all the workers. Then, after 85 decibel, we have the blue situation. So we arrive to the upper action value. At this point, the employer, both for, let's say, level 3 and level 4, that is the blue and the red one, has to perform the health surveillance, has to elaborate and apply specific technical and organizational procedures and measures to reduce this exposure, has to delimitate the place for the level if it is above 85. But for the workers, it's important to use the personal protective equipment. This has to be, is very important to understand that it is an obligation for the worker to use them. On the other side, if you are above 87 decibel and with the peak more than 140 decibel, we have to make measurement to bring this value within the limit, and also the measurement has to be performed with the personal protective equipment weared by the workers, but we have to, let's say, make all the procedural and management improvement to decrease this value. Since more than 87, the risk of noise is very, very high. And so we needed to reduce it. How we measure this noise? We can make measurements at the workers, if especially the worker, let's say, activity has to be in front of an equipment, then go to the other one, and then it moves within different areas. And in this way, we can evaluate the specific worker exposure in its condition for the specific working day. Or otherwise, we can perform the phonometric measurement for the specific source. So, for example, if I have a machine which can produce very, very high noise, we can evaluate this emission, and we can, let's say, identify the specific area where some thinning or some other delimitation has to be applied. It's important to understand, but this is more or less for all the risks, and last time we said also this thing, that the frequency of the evaluation of the risks is, for example, for noise, 4 year as frequency. But for all the risks, we have to take into account that every time I can change something, for example, an equipment, a material, a procedure, and so on, the evaluation has to be updated. We don't need to start from zero every time, but we need to, let's say, evaluate if something is changing. So the phonometer, the instrument that I showed you before, register the signal that is here in red in the slide. We can make some, let's say, calculation and reduction from the measurement if, for example, personal protective equipment are applied, if we know the duration of the exposure, that is not, for example, 8 hours, but less, for less hours or minutes, or I don't know, it depends. And we can identify the final exposure level with these steps of reduction, if they are. otherwise the measurement has to left as from the registration. We need to understand what can be applied as personal protective equipment. There are many types of these equipments, and they are, let's say, provided by the producer with a scale of, let's say, specific covering of the noise. You can select it depending from the measurement of the noise in your company or in front of a specific machine. And you can select the one starting from the technical data sheets of each equipment can cover these specific risks. So also this aspect is available for all the personal protective equipment applied for different risks. So in summary, for the noise risks, what we have to do. So the assessment has to perform it from the starting point, or when we buy a new machine, when we change some operative conditions. Then we have to provide the personal protective equipment above 80 decibel, but they are mandatory only above 85 decibel. We have to perform training and information for workers above 80 decibel, and we have to make medical checkup. It's better above 80, otherwise it's mandatory above 85. We have to make perimetration of the area above 85 and provide, let's say, the improvement of the measurement of the condition if we are above 85. So this is the scheme of what we said in terms of the assessment of the health and safety risks for noise. Then we arrive to the manual handling of loads. This is, let's say, very nice risks, as I said, but it's always present within our working activity. Every time we need to lift, to lay down, to push, to bring, to pull, to move several loads, depending from the loads and the weight of the loads, the dimension. You can find the European directive here in the bottom of the slide, the reference of this evaluation. And, all these, let's say, operations has to be considered when we move any loads. Since the risks, the most important risk is for the back lumbar injuries. So the problem can be if the loads are too heavy, bulky, or difficult to grasp, or we have not a good balance for the moving of this material, or we can have an excessive physical efforts for this moving. In general, from European data, which are the most frequent health problems for workers. So we can have back pain, stress, or limb pain. And all these aspects can cause, so for example, absences from work. And this is important to take into account. So I am not a doctor, but I think all of you knows about the rachis that is made from vertebrae. And we have also the intervertebral discs that is like a pad, elastic pad, that, and when we move with our body, this can be, let's say, pressed, and depending from the weight that we have to bring with us, some specific, let's say, damage can be provided to these discs. Sorry. We have to take into account, let's say, this general. Sorry, there is some Britons in Italian, but I have translated here below. When we are without any load, the disc and the vertebrae are, let's say, symmetric, balanced, and so on. When we take a symmetric load, also, even if the pad is, let's say, pressed, but it's okay. On the contrary, when we take a load asymmetrically, here we can have some damage to the disc. And for example, consider in the picture in the middle, when you take 20 kilograms of for a load, and you are in this position, your invertebral discs can have a compression of about 300 kilograms. So if you take also this load far from your body, also the compression can be higher than 650 kilograms. This is, let's say, an evaluation obviously done by the calculation, but the damage can be very, very important, especially if these are repetitive movements that you have to do during your work activity. So, for example, as we saw before, this movement on your left is wrong, since you press the disc for a very, very high weight. On the contrary, for example, if you take your shoulder rightly and you can push the disc in, let's say, symmetric way, in not with an angle, let's say, this is the right position without any too big, let's say, pressure on your discs. Another consideration, this is a wrong movement. You have not to twist or turn movement taking your feet as they are. The best movement is to move all the body. This is, this is correct. If you move all your body from, let's say, a direction to the other, not only your back and your arms. So when the manual handling loads is a risk, in all these situations, and usually we can have not only one situation, but 2, 3, 4, and so on. So when the load is too heavy, it is bulky or difficult to transport, it is in unstable balance, or its content are in danger of tipping over, it's placed in a position where it must be held or handled at a certain distance from the trunk. So you have to move your trunk. It can, due to the external structure or consistency, lead to injuries, especially in the event of impacts. Required physical effort is performed with the body in a stable position. It's too hot or too cold, depending from the situation, and so on. So, also, based on the characteristics of the work environment, the risks, for example, you have to consider that increase for frequent or prolonged physical efforts, too large distances of lowering, lifting, carrying, or insufficient physiological breaks when the recovery. That is important to make some breaks if, for example, you have repetitive movements. And also if the rhythm is very, very high, it can not be changed by the worker. So, sorry. So which are the recommended movements and the not recommended one? You can see there. So you have, as we say, to keep your, no, sorry, if there is some picture, no? You have to keep your feet firmly planted on the ground, keep your knees bent, stay upright when moving, don't arc your back, and so on. In general, and this is important, the load must not exceed 25 kilograms for men from 18 to 45 years old, 20 kilograms for women from 18 to 45, and for men under 18 or over 45. 50 kilograms for women under 18 and over 45. These are, let's say, the general condition, the general regulation for the transport and the handling of loads. Let's see some example. You have to place a book, quite heavy book, or some, let's say, paper materials on the top of the library. So you have not to put the weight over your head, but you have to take, increase your height in some way, let's say. On the other side, if you have to bring a load, it's better to divide it in 2 different containers and bring them symmetrically. And this is the evaluation of the different loads on your discs for this transportation. For example, if you have to, lift a weight, it's better to bend your legs and not your back. If you have to move a large load, it's better to not push, but not push in front, but with the back. That it's better for your rachis.